Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We're joined today by Dr. Ovamir Anjum, also known as Dr. Ovamir Anjum, because of I think, the difficulty with pronunciation. Um, since Dr. Saab's individual introduction is a bit complicated, I will allow him to do it himself. Dr. Saab.
Jazakumullah, thank you very much for having me. My name, as you said, is Ovamir Anjum, and I'm a professor of Islamic Studies and endowed chair of Islamic Studies at the University of Toledo, Ohio, in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. And I'm a research director at the Yaqeen Institute, the founder of and also research director at the Humanities Institute and editor at the American Journal of Islamic Society.
One of your sort of seminal sort of works is the Tamian Moment, which is an analysis of the unique political philosophy or ideology of Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimullah, and the unique circumstances that he was in. And then you try to juxtapose that, or at least extrapolate from that, what we are experiencing right now. Is that a correct observation of the work that you've done?
Yes. So you're referring to the book published in 2012 at the Cambridge Institute, Cambridge University Press, Politics, Law, and Community in Islamic Thought, the Tamian Moment. And it's an intellectual history of first 7 centuries of Islam, Islamic political thought, the ideas about siyasa, khilafa, imama, and how particularly Ibn Taymiyyah's thought sort of was a pivotal moment as it evaluated that thought in a fresh way. So it's not specifically about Ibn Taymiyyah. The book rather is a new way of looking at Islamic intellectual history through the eyes of an internal critic, if you will.
Right. And nowadays, I think especially the idea of a khilafah is very relevant. It's a potent idea, especially in a post 9/11 or post-war on terror scenario. Considering that you're based out of America and you're looking at these things in an academic perspective, from an academic perspective, do you get a lot of pushback from the Muslim community within America or just the general academic community, or was this a well-received work, or generally your opinions on these things?
So this work in particular, it's academic intellectual history. It was received quite well for, being an academic work. And also, I think in the field of political thought and Islamic political thought, it's quite well received. But that just, what most of my work addresses larger and more contemporary political issues that are based in ideas that were perhaps there, nascent in the book, but they are based in my other work that I've done. So many other articles, as well as other work that I do on both Islamic spiritual thought, Islamic political thought. In particular, my article in 2019, published at the Yaqeen Institute, called Who Wants the Caliphate, which sort of addresses directly the main question. Now, the idea of the caliphate is, of course, a scary idea. It is something, it's one of the most malign words after jihad and sharia, perhaps, in the Western world. And it is also a word of which Muslim ruling classes are also quite apprehensive. But it is nonetheless, I emphasize reclaiming that language from the colonial apparatus, right? And the vocabulary that we use and the vocabulary that we are not allowed to use. I think it is important to reclaim our vocabulary for our thoughts, our memories, desires as an ummah. And that's why I argue that if you do not theorize, if you do not deepen the idea of a proper caliphate. If you don't think about a good caliphate, you're going to get many bad ones. You're going to get many people claiming, because the vocabulary is so resonant and so deep, and the conditions of Muslim suffering across the Muslim world, across the world, in fact, are so deep that if you do not think like an ummah, and when I say, I'm talking about the mainstream ulama and the mainstream intellectuals and people who care about the Muslims, if we are too afraid, then you're going to get extremist fringe movements manipulate our key concepts, whether it's the caliphate or jihad or sharia. And but more positively and constructively speaking, I believe the caliphate is an idea, khilafah, that is at the very heart of Islamic political imagination from the very beginning. Because what it refers to, right, the word khilafah means succession, coming after someone else and doing the work on behalf of someone else. That is succession to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And in that sense, the fundamental problem of politics, where does legitimacy come from and why do you exist as a polity, as a society, that is answered in this, in the word caliphate, right? Your legitimacy does not come from a territory or from a nation, but from the fact that you walk in the footsteps of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and by that logic, anyone who believes in Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam becomes part of your ummah. Inna hadhihi ummatukum ummatan wahida wa ana rabbukum fa'budun. So this ummah that we belong to imposes upon us a responsibility, but honors us with a responsibility and a being the last ummah, being the best ummah. Of course, these are central concepts in the Quran. So that's, if you will, why I believe it's important for us to reclaim our vocabulary.
Right. So let me ask if I've understood that correctly. You said that we have to reclaim this vocabulary because there is a colonial apparatus that we've dealt with in the past 200, 300 years, and going through those filters, some of our very pure and very holy understandings of the idea of jihad or sharia or the khilafah, these things have been tainted. That's one aspect of that. And then you I think it was very appropriate that you said the colonial sort of setup or the colonial apparatus, which in the Muslim world, if you've lived there and you have, mashallah, you've lived in Pakistan a significant amount of years, you're fully aware of the fact that that colonial apparatus is still in action in one way or the other, in judicial processes or the bureaucracy or the way governments are set up in the Muslim world. Given those considerations, that is one aspect of trying to reclaim, let's say, the khilafah from these sorts of the lens of this apparatus, and not allow and to mainstream this, because what that does is that you end up with fringe groups like ISIS, for example, a classical, I think, example of ending up with something that is very ugly, something that is antithetical to Islamic, ideas and theology. It's a blight on the Muslim world, and that only goes so skin deep. And this is my question: is there a greater, and you said this, you implied this, that some of our greater aspirations and desires must be informed by something like the Khilafah, because it's a central idea and it always has been a central theme to our political organization, and our polity derives its legitimacy, its authority from the idea of following in the footsteps of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that would be a secondary or tertiary benefit, right? To deal with something like an ISIS, to deal with fringe thoughts, to deal with extremist ideas. Would the mainstream centripetal force, the mainstream goal be to reimagine ourselves in the modern world with some sort of loose framework of a khilafah or an actual khilafah, or just general across the board increased Muslim cooperation? What is the practical sort of, and I know this is an academic conversation, but I'm going to keep trying to ground it in practical realities. What is the outcome that is to be expected from a young person when they view the world through the lens of the Khilafah, uh,
Yes,
as
I
you
think
presented
it's a
it.
brilliant question and a very important question. I think I know where you're getting at. So let me first say that we have a genocide occurring right now, and our first qibla uh, and our one of our holiest places that is the center of sha'air of Islam, the protection of which is one of the central obligations. It's like Medina has been attacked, right? And to then, like, do we need another reason to understand, to appreciate how vulnerable we as Muslims are? I think that how we have gotten here, one has to know that history, that since for the last 100 years or so, the Muslim world has spiraled down. Despite many other occurrences, the rise and fall of many other people, one thing that we have seen is that the Muslim world has been spiraling down, despite many achievements that we will also, inshallah, get a chance to talk about. It nevertheless is the case that politically we have never been as humiliated, as insignificant, as divided. We have never lacked deterrence in a way that you have a pariah, you have a state, an occupying colonial settler power that betted on the fact, if effectively Israel made a bet that 50 Muslim countries are not going to do anything, even if we week by week, day by day, month by day, kill Palestinians en masse, if we make Jerusalem our capital, if we, do ethnic cleansing and genocide, and we can do anything against this group of people that would not be accepted against any other group of people in the world. And I think the only way to understand this situation is that you have to think in bigger terms. It's not simply that Israel, and the United States decided that there is this one civilization, 1/4 of humanity that could be liquidated. But there is, for anyone who's a believer, but if you're not a believer, I think you should become a believer to understand how this has happened, because this level of humiliation, this level of nothingness, this level of dhillah, as we say, this level of oppression. I'll give you perhaps an anecdote can fully capture what I'm saying. In the concentration camps in the Holocaust, right? As the Holocaust is taking place, the German soldiers, you know what they used to call the Jews? They used to call them Musalman, because the word Musalman over the course of the 20th century has come to mean somebody who has no worth, who is completely submissive.
That's insane, by the way.
Yes.
Was that a common practice, or was it like an isolate? Was it like when they say kafir in South Africa to describe the blacks in South Africa?
I mean, there is this understanding is generated in British India, right? And then it spreads through Europe, and so German soldiers use that. And I don't know how widespread the practice was, but I think that it speaks to the kind of humiliation that Muslims have at times faced. And then there were, of course, anti-colonial movements. There were moments where this understanding of Muslims as helpless was interrupted, and the Ummah rose up. And there are many other stories that I don't want to tell you, just the story of humiliation and powerlessness, but merely to say that in order to fully understand this humiliation, we have to think metaphysically. Something that's happening to this 1/4 of humanity, 1/5 to 1/4 of humanity, and there is no response. The entire world order was set up after the Second World War to avoid something like this from happening. All of the wars have been justified, all the international system, international law, moral ethics are justified in the name of never letting something like the Holocaust and the Second World War happen again. The United Nations and the international law. And yet, when this happens to Muslims, the same powers not only justify it, but in fact, they accuse anyone who wants merely a ceasefire, not correction of the errors or not the end of the occupation, but merely for a ceasefire. That person gets labeled as an extremist, a terrorist, and so on.
Anti-Semite. So I think, there's a lot of choice words.
So that's a moment of reflection for us as Muslim Ummah, which I think should be sufficient to propel us to a different understanding in the world. In the world.
So you're seeing the language of Khilafah and Sharia, and thinking about on the level of an Ummah as the appropriate tools in terms of language to escape this sort of colonial amnesia that we have. Not only do we have a colonial hangover, we also have a collective amnesia with regards to the suffering that we've had and the sort of zillah that we've had in the last 200, 300 odd years. So do you see it just as an educational device or tool, or do you see it something beyond the scope of, or do you think that it's too early right now? Like, we're in a generation which needs this sort of language, this sort of equipment to deal with this, and then subsequently something will come of that? Or do you expect that the moment that young people in today's day and age in the Muslim world, in a very connected Muslim world, by the way, vis-a-vis the internet and air travel and all these conveniences of the modern world, do you see it something like setting, and I'm spreading like a wildfire, and I'm using wildfire in a positive sense, that if this idea is put out into the ether, into the zeitgeist, and it's quite clear that the young people are hungry for some sort of political component to Islam, because they're not satisfied with just the individual development and spirituality element of it, which has been the most popular version in the past, 50 to 100, 200 years. Do you think that this language is the way forward in terms of actually galvanizing young people to do something about it? Or is it because in terms of practical reality, it means a lot for young people, because they're risking their livelihoods, their lives, imprisonment, whatever, when they engage in conversations like a conversation about jihad or the Sharia or the Caliphate, anything beyond the sort of the secular or the Islamic liberal democracy or whatever forms that we have, if they question that, if they talk about this in varying degrees in these 50 odd countries, you will become a pariah in the least.
So there is a lot there in that question, and the short answer is that no, I don't think it's merely an educational tool, but in our deen, everything must begin with education. Everything must begin with La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, and a few people believing it, right? Everything, it begins in Mecca, but we are never we are not in Meccan state in the sense that we have 50 Muslim countries, but nevertheless, in terms of ideas, I think that we need to ground our ideas in the deep Islamic tradition and the revelation, and so that's the beginning. But I also believe that every generation has its own mission. So I cannot say that I'm going to do something and then another generation is going to pick up. The 20, 30, 40 years that we have is all we have. We don't know what the next generation is going to be like, what their mission is going to be like, but they're going to build on what we have. Nevertheless, I don't think we have that right. We got to do what we do now, right? So in that sense, I do think that this must be a very practical plan. But what does that mean? I think that's the question. The idea that you have to, you become pariah and you are targeted and so on, I think that's only if you understand the Caliphate or the Ummah in a particular way. And that's the understanding that we at Ummatics and a number of think tanks, a number of scholars around the world are beginning to question, because that is a colonial understanding, that is a self-defeating understanding, that you can, as the environmentalist movement teaches, you can think globally and act locally. That's in fact the only way of thinking and acting. There may be another way, like you can think locally and act globally. That's also a possibility sometimes.
So continuing
And
with
so you
the
have,
so continuing with the ecological movement. So not the Unabomber. Not so we're not supposed to become the Unabomber. Speaking in terms of the environmental movement, we're not supposed to be
yes.
eco-fascists, right? We're not supposed to blow up airliners.
Well, yes. So that's, the environment movement is so many different things. I think that's a great example.
What
You
about
can
just
become
stop oil?
experiment.
What about just stop oil? Are we supposed to be social activists? Are we supposed to streak naked outside of I don't know, car
I mean, so
manufacturers?
those are examples, right? I'm using analogy right now,
I'm just
but I
messing.
think
I'm
that
just messing with you.
it is true that I think for the environmental concern has to be fundamental to any understanding about proper caliphate, our stewardship of the earth, right? It's Umran al-Ard is absolutely necessary if we are going to think about Islam as a guide for world making, not world
No,
renouncing.
you misunderstood my question. Just using the
Okay.
example of environmental activism, I'm trying
Right.
to place the activism that you're putting forward. Obviously, it's not an activism in of its own. It's also an academic endeavor that you're pursuing. But the activism, it's not supposed to look like a Unabomber style activism, right? You're not supposed to be eco-fascist or eco-terrorist. It's not supposed to
Yeah.
be.
No, I absolutely agree.
I have a
Understand your
this is the,
example. I'm simply taking it forward and saying that it is correct that you could understand a project that is as large and audacious, as hopeful as the environmental movement. The problem is so big that you can go crazy. Or you can think about it in the way that the environmentalist movement could, which is it involves science, it involves institutional design, it involves people who are thinking in terms of capitalism. They think of it as better forms of capitalism. People think of socialism. They think in better forms of socialism, and so on and so forth, and better governance. So my point is that qiyas, that analogy that you're making, I like that, and I think that. In the same way, right, that because the problem is enormous, people feel hopeless. And because people feel hopeless, they give up and they embrace a very destructive way of being. But I worked quite a bit on environmental movement and science and religion. Science is my background. So I recognize the limitation of, in fact, the environmentalist movement. It doesn't have aqidah. It doesn't have an individual responsibility and a way of being in the world. So that's why it's often hijacked by any other group. And that's why I believe that the Khilafah grounded in proper Islamic understanding, but also very much a futuristic, one might say, institutional design, not merely embracing the present world, but in fact a futuristic Khilafah, a very modern Khilafah, one might say.
I mean, I'm just going to go through the sort of the FAQs when it comes to Khilafah, right? When people have their doubts,
Sure.
one of them being the way to organize, right? That was the first point that we just had just an aside about, which was more often than not, because people feel hopeless or helpless, they give into more destructive ideologies, and you had the whole pan-Islamic jihad movement, post the 1950s and 60s when we started to all become independent nation states, that culminated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the fiasco in Syria. And there was elements of it in the Arab Spring as well. One of the more, in that same vein, a lot of the Islamic movements and all those energies went into the Ikhwan, they went into the Jamaat, they went into the democratic process because they wanted to believe that this was something that could bear fruit for them.
Right.
Is that a more effective route, building institutions within the framework of these nationhoods and trying to work with academics and research institutions and think tanks? Because the Jamaat model and the Ikhwan model has become very unpopular in the youth in Egypt as well as in Pakistan. I can talk specifically about Pakistan because they see the Jamaat as like placeholder charity organization as opposed to Jamaat as the active political force, right?
Right.
So that is an iterative model that we've maybe worked out in the past 50, 60 odd years across the Ummah.
Yeah.
So if it's not that, if it's not violent, sort of jihad organizations or martyrdom movements, what is it? What does it look like for and what is the localized responsibility?
So I think that you're asking us at least two different questions. One is the question of what it would look like, and the other is how you get there. So let me address the question of what first. And the short answer to that is what I was saying, that you need modern institutional design, which uses the modern technologies. I mean, we are talking the world where, if you go read NASA statement, they talk about colonizing Mars and by the 2030s. And nearly every country in the world, every region in the world has developed a modern nation state, which itself is a miracle that historically for 10,000, 12,000 years of human history, settled human history, you didn't have centralized institutions that could do. So in other words, new things are happening in the world all the time. So why Muslims cannot do that, right? That's often the question that's asked. And I dismiss that question as simply being the wrong question. The question is, what would that institutional design look like? And it could look like something like a European Union, although it has its limitations. We can talk about that. It could look like the United States. Early United States started very much in a similar kind of situation. And it could look like something else. And that's
we have a joke here, by the way, at the podcast.
All right, tell me the joke.
It's called Stanistan.
What's Stan?
Stanistan.
It's Stanistan, yes. Tell me what that means.
It's the amalgam of all the stans, because we have so South Asian Islam is sort of it comes through the Persian Central Asian bypass.
Yes, right. So the Persianate world.
Yes. So we have a lot of cultural cross-cultural pollination and trade opportunities because we get to access the Eastern European and Russian markets. So from an economic standpoint, from a geopolitical, geographic standpoint, these regions have never been not disconnected. Above the Indus River, these regions have always sort of been one contiguous loose territory. So Stanistan is an inevitability, which is what we joke about all the time.
So there is economic element to that, I think. And I usually start by saying simply, tell yourself stories. The more you read into history, the more connections you find, the more alternatives you find. Don't let history be your glass ceiling, but let your imagination be challenged by it. Often, I think presentism is a big enemy for all of us. And sometimes history is a liberation, but for some other people, right, it could become the end or the glass ceiling, and we should avoid that as well. And that's why I say that you read history to destroy presentism, but then go beyond it and think bigger than that. Because things like that, things that are bigger that have never happened in history, are happening all the time. Over the last 100 years, I can name dozens of things, like major historical movements that would have been thought as impossible. including democracy itself, which I'm not saying that democracy is what we want or what we need. That's a separate question. But my point is that for 2,500 years in human history, democracy was a laughed at idea, right? It was something that Plato and Aristotle wrote about as being ridiculous, and including our own philosophers, Farabi and others, wrote about this as a corruption of political form and so on. But when it starts to pick up, that idea becomes now central to human political imagination, good or bad. My point is simply that ideas that are seen as dead for 2,500 years can be picked back up. So why not the idea of the caliphate after 100 years? So I think that's why that imagination, any objection that comes from this lack of imagination, I think that we should be very suspicious of it.
All right. So one of the core tenets of you bringing back the word Khilafah, the ideas of surrounding the caliphate into the mainstream, is to reinvigorate the imagination of the average Muslim. Because if we can think it, if we can put it into words, then it becomes something that's much more real than maybe if it came through a Western lens. Now, you use a lot of language that would be considered sort of like the language of the left, right? Post-colonial, glass ceiling. I have this sort of sneaking suspicion that a lot of revolution that has entered Islam, right? A lot of these revolutionary ideas that have entered the mainstream of Islamic thought with all these organizations, even the Jamaat and the Ikhwan, a lot of it is borrowing from the ideas of their time and a sort of Marxist sort of reading of Islam, which is very popular, by the way, a very Marxist sort of socialist reading of Islam. And when speaking about the economic systems of Islam or the political organization of Islam, it always has liberal democracy at its best, and then at its worst, it will be some sort of socialist paradise with Islamic social features. This lack of originality in thought has been one of the killers, by the way, I suspect, for the last 100, 200 years for all of these movements. Some of them were inspired straight up by fascism. One of the founding sort of visionary fathers of Pakistan, Iqbal, was someone who was very critical of democracy and Marxism and socialism. It was, in his ideas, he was all over the place because he was a poet and he was developing his ideas, obviously, through his poetry. But you find that sort of that lack of grounding and that all over the placeness in a lot of Islamic thought and in a lot of Islamic movements. If you look at non-democratic movements in Pakistan as well, I don't know how well aware you are of them, like Tanzeem Islami, which was an offshoot of the Jamaat, and then subsequently there's a new one called Shubban al-Muslimin, which is an offshoot of the Tanzeem, because they didn't feel like they were, revolutionary enough. Or there's always this idea of revolution, this idea of the people's republic, of a people's democracy. How, quote unquote, Islamic, or how, quote unquote, well grounded are they in the actual historical idea of a khilafah? Or are we allowed to reimagine these things in a more modern context? Like you were speaking about technologies playing a role. So just as a random off the top of my head example, given the directness of technology in today's day and age, would you have direct votes in the parliament, in the Senate, in the Shura from your mobile phones on every single bill, for example, with 24/7 live streams going on of the debates in the Shura? This is a real imagination, like a real problem that we can imagine in Islamic khilafah or democracy with Islamic values or the other way around. How do we resolve these ideas? Because this is a variety of questions. I speak my English is, I cannot be precise with it.
No, I think you're great and very fluent, mashallah. Able to say a lot more quicker than I am. But I wanted to frame the discussion that we were talking about what, and also the question of how. And then in that, you presented a critique of the existing Islamic movements, and then the question of democracy. So let me say something about this, the question of what, meaning that what would that look like in ideal form? And there I want to say that the modern technologies modern ways of connecting are always surprising us, but we also have wisdom as well as limitations, from the fiqh, Quran and Sunnah and so on. I think that local conditions and local ways of being should be preserved. So it may be that Pakistan has some form of democracy, whereas Tunisia has, a different kind of democracy, electoral system, let's say, rather than democracy. Whereas Yemen has a tribal system where they, appoint certain sheikhs who represent them in a Muslim union somewhere. And so all of those things are possible. A much more complex tapestry of systems is possible, and that's what, in my view, being modern means. Of course, I'm using the word modern only to signal some things because people usually find it difficult to imagine that something Islamic, a caliphate, could be like that. And a footnote to that, I talk about this in the article I wrote, was called "Who Wants the Caliphate?" at the Eon Institute. It's available if anybody wants to check. I present a history of what the caliphate meant.
We'll pin the links to your article in the book, inshallah.
Yeah, thank you. So the caliphate took at least 4 to possibly 5 different forms throughout history in terms of how religion and politics and institutions were arranged. There was the Khilaf al-Rashida, and then there were the imperial caliphs, the Umayyads and the early Abbasids, and then the late Abbasids, which did not have political power, but they had enormous political say. Symbolically, they held the Muslim world together. And then you could say the Ottomans came back and they brought back political and religious power together. These are all different forms of the caliphate. And then starting in the late 19th century, you could say that another attempt was made. The attempt failed, which was the constitutional caliphate. It didn't last very long, but the point was that imagination was possible. And so when we think of the caliphate, we're not talking about a particular institutional form. But at the same time, we're not talking about nothing either. It's not merely a symbol or an emotion. It is an institutional setup that has certain requirements. What they are, I'm going to set that aside. I've written quite a bit about that. So could there be modern form of caliphate that allows various local administrations and local traditions to continue and become more robust? Yes. And in fact, to me, that would be the best ideal. Now, it doesn't mean that things are not going to change, but things could change through what you were calling a revolution, which means sort of a mass movement. Things could change top down as well. It could change through mergers of states, like big corporations merge. That's not unheard of. And there are pros and cons in each kind of movement. So I think that we just need to expand our imagination and explore these things. In the modern world, for example, you could think of a digital union that is held together by a number of, transactions that people are making. Right. And so all of that is the issue of how. I think that should be explored. And at the end of the day, people worry about, well, we want to live, some people's concern is we want to just be able to live a decent life and not be cut to pieces every now and then. Other people's concerns are more ideological. We have to live under the Sharia. And I think all of those are valid concerns, the concerns of, and they should be represented, they should be strengthened, they should be argued. And the creation of a unified discursive sphere, an integrated Muslim discursive sphere, such where the ideas of how this could happen, these should be openly discussed. These should be ideas that should become common to a generation of people from east and west, north and south, people in the United States and in the United and may write about this, and people in Pakistan, people in Egypt, people in Tunisia, people in Saudi may write about against it. They might say, well, this is a better way. And you should be able to share a language as a public sphere, if you will, a unified public sphere, such that, language these days is not really a very big hurdle, right? So even though having a shared language, English in these days, ironically, English, the language of the colonizer, actually has been in many ways tamed. And today, English-speaking Muslims, in fact, if you consider them one nation, would be larger than almost any other Muslim country. In fact, the number I heard last was 300 million, which is greater than Indonesia or Pakistan. So the point is that these kind of connections that globalization has made possible, we must take advantage of them. But at the same time, other Muslims who do not share that language can participate in that public sphere. So that all I'm saying here is to explode this imagination so that this idea should not come out of the mind of one genius, and then people are fighting over, whether this person was a perfect Ma'soom Wali or not, but rather this should be a discursive, right? Now, to the question of Tanzim Islami, for instance, I'm great respect for Dr. Israr Ahmed.
Of course.
And love him. But at the same time, many of the ideas that he had were very, particular ideas that came out of a particular reading, for example, of the Sirah.
Yes.
And that was not a historically well-informed reading of the Sirah, but it was nevertheless, an argument or in conversation with great scholars of the time. It's possible to make this a much more robust reading of not only the Sirah, but the entire Muslim history. And so in that, let me go to the question of how, and particularly the issue of these Islamic movements that you have raised, particularly Ikhwan and Jamaat and so on, and their way of transforming. I think I want to emphasize the point that you made, which is that these movements were a product of mid-20th century nation-state creation or nationalist movements. I do not see them as, dismissible because they came out of a particular context. I think that they represented, nevertheless, a moment of nationalist mobilization in much of the Muslim world. They were only possible and necessary in some ways because a new kind of Muslim society had emerged. If you go from 19th century to the 20th century, the number of Muslims that could read, simply they were able to read and were reading stuff about the world, had exploded, had gone from at most 5% in an urban center. So it would be 2-3% of Muslims were literate, to you have potentially 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and sometimes up to 90 plus percentage of the population in Muslim countries, Muslim regions that are able to read. What were they going to read about Islam? These movements provided that because Islam was understood as a technical language between the ulama before. And so these movements were born out of this need
to democratize Islam and to make it easily accessible for this.
Exactly.
In the context of the new nation state and this polity limited by national boundaries, and they have a passport and they have an ID card and there's a constitution or a monarchy or some sort of parliament above them. I'm completely fair. I'm not trying to critique them outside of the context of their existence. They're completely within the context of their existence. But I'm saying that this energy. So this energy is split between some sort of Islamic democracy within the given framework of whatever Muslims might have in Pakistan, and I'm talking about Pakistan specifically, or between this sort of people who would tilt towards the Hizb or other organizations like that or other movements like that and talk about just a complete upheaval of any liberal democratic processes, and then we have to start over, very etch a sketch version of, like we have to shake this thing out and then completely, reimagine Pakistan or our Islamic identity, very anti-nationalist sort of sentiments. Now, these guys tend to get rooted out quicker from the bureaucracy that exists, the superstructure within Pakistan, but they still exist in their numbers, and it is a sentiment. Not only, it's not just skin deep, it's a very deeply held belief amongst the average public as well. There's no point in voting, and what's the point of participating, and who cares about the Jamaat, and the Jamaat are really good people, but they're never going to win. They're never going to have any sizable number in the parliament or the local assemblies. So these kinds of ideas, I would say these are the two ideas that are constantly struggling amongst the religious average public, where either they want to do away with the system entirely, or they think that maybe we can still compete within the given framework. However, in the especially post the 9/11 and the post war on terror era, now the popularity has completely shifted towards an upheaval system, which of the system, which is like this revolutionary idea about, and the Tanzim was about this. A lot of other organizations are about this, that, if we work, and we gain critical mass, if we have X, Y, Z number, some of them focus on, people in power positions. Now, these kinds of violent or semi-violent coups or revolutions, we've seen that play out as well. Because a very fair critique of a very fair and a very practical critique immediately of these ideas comes from the left or even from the conservative sides of the Muslims, where they'll say, like, look at Tunisia, look at Egypt, look at Libya, what came from the Arab Spring, from any sort of popular democratic movement or populist movement even. So where does this lie? Where does the answer lie? In just academic discussion, mainstreaming the conversation? How do we appease these sentiments amongst the public? Because somehow Islam has become tied up. The core of this is that Islam has become tied up with the idea of civilian supremacy and individual freedoms. This has become synonymous. These two ideas have become synonymous. So how do you reconcile that with what's going on in Palestine, in Pakistan right now, or generally in the Muslim world? How do you get them to be patient with it?
That the academic process is not so much of how to do, what to do. That is Islam. The academic is merely a process to better assess and compare ideas, and to test them, to go back to the sources and read them more accurately, and to assess good and bad ideas. And in that sense, when you look at, for example, the idea that the Arab Spring has failed, or the Islamic movements have failed, or that the change must be top down, it must be the militaries that, or some governments that must come, and a coup, an Islamic coup or Islamic revolution, or the opposite idea that it must be always evolutionary, that it must be that we change person one by one, either by starting, in the Sufi way, or by reforming their nafs, or Ahl Hadith way, maybe by teaching them more about the Prophet Sunnah alayhi salam, or maybe Hanafi way by everybody following the proper Hanafi authority, or perhaps by, in a more reformist way, which everybody becoming a better intellectual, and so on. These are all competing ideas. And once you examine them, you actually are able to much better see their pros and cons. And if you're able to look at history better, I think that's one of the things that I really emphasize. All of these are different ways in which great change takes place. None of them is sufficient, and you cannot preclude any of them. Meaning that it is quite possible that change will come, or there will be a particular kind of change that will come top down by a better leader getting elected or coming to power. But it is also often the case that these leaders are unable to do anything if you do not have discourse available, if you do not have technocrats available, if you do not have technologies available, if you do not have mass movements available. And the other way around. So you may have a mass movement, for example, that points out certain grievances and points out certain ways of how Muslims can become more educated and more informed. And yet, if they're not paying attention to the availability of proper technocrats to run even a small neighborhood, let alone a country, they are likely to fail. If you do not have politicians who can speak to a large number of masses, ideological transformation and education elevation takes place among a small vanguard. This was true even at the time of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. A small number of people were transformed. Majority of people need a politician to speak to them. So all of these things, the more you study, the more you realize, and that's why I think the academic process and elevation of Muslim discourse is important, so that some of these false dichotomies, false oppositions, the useless fights are replaced with better, the conversation.
So what I'm getting from you is that voting isn't haram?
Yes. I do not think that voting per se is haram, but there may be conditions, circumstances when voting is tied to an act that says people and not Sharia and not God and not God's law, but whatever people say that must be like. And there may be cases when that's what an election means. But in most cases in a country like Pakistan, that's not what it means, right? It's ambiguous at best. Pakistan, a country that claims to be based in Islam and needs to be an Islam's experiment and Islam's laboratory and so on and so forth, that understanding, you may say, you know what, that understanding was just on paper and doesn't mean anything. But that's we have to understand one of the fundamental commitments of Islamic tradition that I find most important is to appreciate the epistemology and the basis of what you are saying. If you are saying your argument is based in the Quran and the Sunnah, then it's either definitive, in which case all Muslims agree on it, or it is dhanni, it is conjectural, in which case you have to make your argument, or it is an argument based in siyasa, not in Sharia, but rather what you think would be better for Muslims, in which case you have to give your arguments and embrace the fact that other Muslims are going to disagree. And you make your case. And the Jama'at, I think, have done great, enormous service in many things, right? But epistemologically, in understanding and trying to solve these intellectual problems, they were never equipped to do that. We need think tanks, we need ulama, we need other associations, we need technocrats, we need entrepreneurs, people who are go-getters, people who do business, and so on. And that's why what I think of one way to move forward is to create this discursive sphere where this discussion can take place among various stakeholders. One of the things that these jama'ats often start with is the idea that we are like the Prophet ﷺ. We are starting from Sifr, we're starting from zero, and there are good people inside and bad people outside. I can understand that feeling of isolation that sort of propels you to change the world, but I think it is almost always erroneous. We live in an ummah where there are 100 revivals taking place in every Muslim country that you go to, and non-Muslim countries in the United States and the UK and Australia and elsewhere. Wherever you have Muslim communities, you have people who are trying to revive the deen. And that was not always the case, by the way.
No, but it's a positive thing that at least in Pakistan, what I've observed is the otherization that existed in these jamaats has broken down simply by virtue of time and technology. There is cooperation and coordination across the aisle, whether it be in the media sphere or the actual political scene, in academics. That much is quite clear that everyone sort of learned their lesson with otherizing other movements or individuals or academics or intellectuals, even the public, even the average public was otherized by a lot of these groups, because it was all about the in group, the Jamaat, and everybody who is working towards that particular goal. The idea is starting to spread that this is a collective effort, and an ecosystem needs to be created around this. Like you said, a discursive sort of conversation needs to start, as opposed to ulama or Jamaats giving out edicts about how things ought to be. And we've talked about how much of a role the democratic process can play, because there's always going to be an interplay between, is it a bottom up thing, is it a top down thing? And I think everyone needs to be allowed to do have their own individual pursuit in terms of siyasa, because everyone thinks this is the best option, and they're out presenting their case. But we're all engaged in a sort of similar exercise in trying to reach some sort of ultimate goal with pan-Islamic cooperation and better governance and these sorts of things. In the practical realities of it, I notice a lot in the conversations that ulama have and academics have, Afghanistan is completely ignored. Afghanistan is and some of it I think is just oversight, because it's a smaller country, and it doesn't have the sort of historical background in politics and technology, maybe in modern technologies, and we don't see it as an economic power, and maybe it doesn't have that kind of population. But sometimes I also feel like it is purposefully ignored, because it's something that in Western ulama especially, but in also in the Muslim world, because it's something that's a bit of a sensitive issue with their own local governments. Or Afghanistan, I don't want to come out and say it isn't entirely a model of success, but they're clearly on the path to something. They clearly have an idea of what kind of social and political organization they want. They have certain economic goals. They have certain civilizational goals that they're trying to set out. And I haven't seen this modern ecosystem come to the aid of the Afghan people. I mean, the material aid exists. There's all these organizations trying to organize, soup kitchens and help them build hospitals or whatever. We haven't seen ulama rush to Afghanistan for conferences, for dialogue. It's all behind closed doors. It's very hush-hush. And one would have expected the sort of Hanafi spread in Central and South Asia, especially within the subcontinent. And more specifically, the Deobandi movement would have seen it as an opportunity to maybe reimagine their position in the subcontinent as well as in Central Asia. But unfortunately, we didn't see that. And I think we're forcing Afghanistan into more of an isolation, where they're primarily dealing with Russia and China as opposed to other Muslim nations. Iran has played a relatively positive role in this, where they have trade relations and with Afghanistan, not with all their border disputes notwithstanding, and the history of bad blood. But Pakistan in particular has played a very poor role. I can't say as to the other Stan countries what their roles have been and might be in the future. But for Pakistan, it seems quite clear that we're clearly wanting to pursue a Western-centric policy and maybe isolate or ignore Afghanistan for as long as we can. Would you say that I'm putting too much or betting too much on Afghanistan, or do you think there's something there?
So I think that the problem that most countries have, if you're talking about taking lessons from Afghanistan, is that on the one hand, Afghanistan offers this great example of resilience and military success. But the greatest challenge that people face are two. One, scale. You see, a small government where you have not dealt with the complexity of large economy and diverse economy and diverse forces within the country. It's a very different kind of problem than what you have as after a conquest, for example, in a country with very little or no economy. So the thing is that Afghanistan has shown a great example or Taliban, right, in that they can resist, they can defeat the imperialists, something that Afghanistan has done, of course, historically over and over. but can it become a kind of Muslim government that can be that can deal with the internal problems, that can deal with building up an economy and with giving, sufficient, freedoms to different groups of people? Can it motivate different groups of people to participate in the collective project? So that's number one. Number two, and a bigger problem is, of course, the international context. The Taliban in Afghanistan was made a pariah state by the United States. It's the same reason, the same source for the genocide that is taking place in Gaza, and the same reason why all Muslim countries, Sunni countries, have betrayed them, have failed to step up, right? So it's, I think that we in our conversation, we hit up again and again against this elephant in the room, which is that there is the American influence. And Gaza has shown us, Afghanistan has shown us, is that it's not as invincible, it's not as inevitable, it's not as fixed as many of our ruling elite wanted to think that it is.
I suspect that not to cast aspersions, but I genuinely don't even think that they believe it. I think it's just that their individual interests are so deeply tied with the Western world. And I can talk about Pakistan specifically. A lot of the top brass within the military, as well as the judicial processes and the political class, they have so many financial interests tied with the West, even on a cultural level. And they will pay millions of dollars to go live in Paris or London or New York or California or whatever, because they're colonized on a very deep cultural level, where cuisine, I mean, that's not even imaginable for them with China, because we had a very decent working relationship in Pakistan specifically with China, and we completely, sorry for my French, but we completely screwed over the Chinese, because there was not enough cultural connect for them on individual levels to even think that they could pursue the sort of lifestyles that the Muslim elite generally pursues in the West. They've idealized the West. They watch their movies, they speak the language, they eat the food, and then to top it all off, they have business interests there. They've invested millions into real estate.
What you're saying to me, and I like to think optimistically, if what the reason is not geopolitical facts, if the reason is culture, then that's a great opportunity, right?
And financial dependency for them individually. It's their individual utility. Because again,
right. But if culture plays that role, and I think what you're saying, there is a lot of truth to that, although there are different analyses of whether it's mere geopolitics. There are people who may think, for example, that China would never go all the way, the way the CIA does, assassinating people and creating a mass death in poor countries in order to get their candidate. China doesn't do that kind of thing. China will kill a lot of Muslims in its own country, but it will not do all of this. It just doesn't have the appetite or the apparatus for this. And so when it comes to helping us against this or that country, my point is simply that there are different analyses, which I'm not an expert in, but to the extent that culture and belief and taste plays a role, and I think that you're absolutely right, it does some, I don't know to what extent, that is something that can be part of this cultural, intellectual revolution that I think is very much within our capacity in this generation. I want to say one final thing that came, before, I guess, if you have any other questions, but the nation state keeps coming up as whether it's something that should be transcended or destroyed or opposed single-mindedly or embraced and worked within, and of course the militaries as the keepers of the nation state in most of these Muslim majority countries. I think that that itself is a result of a very simplistic understanding of the nation state. The nation state is not one single thing. Its parameters are imposed by geopolitics to a large extent, before globalization, in the era of developmentalism, after the Second World War, the nation state played a much more central role in the wealth distribution and development and progress, quote unquote, in a country. And that is the era in which many of our Islamic movements, Islamic thinkers, they thought that the way to get to Islam is by capturing the state first and then using Islamic kind of programs to change the society. After 1980s, as when that fundamental equation began to change, multinational corporations became much more important. Capital became much more important than politics, and politicians played increasingly a smaller and smaller role in how much actual freedom they had. And so Islamic economics actually took off at that time, because in this era of neoliberalism, that became an sort of an alternative way to influence. But after the global war on terror, 2001, the entire world was remade in the image of this American securitized world. And that, I think, is not something that, for the last 20 or so years, 15 or 20 years after 2001, nearly every Muslim, not only Muslim, but every other state in the world rearranged its priorities to either take advantage of and to distance itself from Islam in a particular way and take advantage of the global war on terror and penalize its Muslim population one way or the other, because that became the way to guarantee to the West that we are your men. We'll deliver the silence of these lambs to you. We'll turn our countries into open air prisons so long as you let us stay in power. That was the new social contract that is made after 9/11, 2001. That, I think, contract has begun to erode, and I think we are getting to a point as a result of, of course, China, multipolarity of the world, and Gaza and Russia, that we have a new possible world emerging in which, and I'm sure that I'm not saying anything new that's not well known to the people, but at this point, I think it's important to have a global vision. People who think in strictly nationalistic terms, and what I mean by that is that their imagination is limited to a particular locality. They're both important, but they're also selling Islam short. They're selling Islamic possibilities short. And only in that sense, I am very critical of nationalism, not in the sense that we do not need to think and work locally, but you have to think globally. You have to think ummatically. And Islamic movements will do well to become more global, to listen to connect with at all different levels, intellectual level, exchange students, exchange scholars, learn, work with traders, people who can trade. I mean,
practically, I just want to ask you this final thing. Practically, does it mean anything beyond papers, joint conferences, sharing ideas? Is there a more individual approach to this, or a more public approach where the average individual gets to participate? Because that latent energy in a lot of young people, it goes to waste online maybe, or participating in things that might not be so fruitful for them or for the overall the ummatic level fruition of these ideas. What are the practical steps for an individual? Like, how do they force this conversation into the zeitgeist? How do they bring this to the limelight? How do they imbibe this spirit locally while working, while thinking or imagining globally? But how do they work locally? This is a complete layperson, they're working a job, running a business, They want to connect with you and your ideas, and they want to connect with different organizations locally and work with them. What is the best way forward for the individual?
I think that for the individual, everyone has possibilities that they're familiar with. We have our trajectories. You are maybe seeking education. Maybe you're a business person. Maybe you are simply a mother who can tell your child in your lullabies, about Palestine and Kashmir. Maybe that's your level, right? Maybe you are a writer who is going to explode the imagination, because a lot of times it's our imagination, right, that kills us or propels us. I think that in a state of hopelessness, that is when people turn to negative ideas. That's when people turn against each other. That's when people lose hope. That's when people's quality of life goes down. Of course, there are very real concerns that the ulama and local scholars and local activists are talking about that are dealing with people in learning Islam, right? That's learning Islam and practicing Islam with hope in the ummah. That is itself, I think, transformative. That's revolutionary. If you're doing that, you are part of the solution. The Prophet ﷺ said that, every one of you is, Islam is a fortress with many entrances, many gates, and you are on your own, right? You are on one of those. Don't let the enemy enter from your side. So the question is, if you have this kind of global ummatic understanding, you still have to act locally. Whether you're writing a story, whether you are engaging in business in a way that is fair, or maybe perhaps you're protesting how your state is expelling Afghani refugees or Afghanis, for instance. These are all different possibilities. It may simply be that you will not participate in acrimonious kind of political debate. Try to improve the way you think about the ummah, think about differences with other Muslims. Like you may be a Barelwi and who simply who thinks that your biggest enemy is a Deobandi, and perhaps an ummatic thinking will make you realize that, well, you agree with 90% of what this Deobandi believes, and maybe you are, a brother in Islam, and maybe, right, there is something that you can do together that's far more important, that maybe you can learn from Deobandi ulama and Ahl Hadith ulama and Jamaati ulama, while being a Barelwi, and you can replace that example. I don't mean to target the Barelwis in particular.
Fair enough.
The Shia-Sunni problem, a major problem that ordinary people either advance and aggravate or improve on. I think that that is a major problem that we think Sunnis, for example, do not. And I say that because I'm a Sunni, but I think that Sunnis have all kinds of conspiracy theories about the Shia, and of course vice versa, fully understood. But all of these things are, things that we can do that are necessary to, being a proper Muslim, being more ummatic.
Dr. Professor Ovamir, Anjum, thank you so much for your time. We'll pick up where we left off soon, inshallah, hopefully. And we'll stick to more pointed subjects now that you've had like a brief introduction to the channel. I hope we can keep doing these kinds of conversations and talk about more pointed and specific examples or, excerpts from history. Unfortunately, we couldn't get too deep into the Tamian Moment. Something with the timing and the scheduling, and inshallah we'll pick up from here next time, inshallah.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for your time. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.